There is a carving on a temple ceiling in Egypt that shows a helicopter, not something that vaguely resembles one if you squint. A rotor, a tail boom, a cockpit, and beside it, cut into the same stone beam, three more shapes that researchers have compared to a submarine, a gunship, and a jet. The stone is over 3,000 years old. The machines it appears to show would not exist for another 3 millennia. Most tourists walk right underneath it and never look up. The beam sits high above eye level in a dim hall inside one of the oldest and most sacred temples in all of Egypt. And for more than a century, almost nobody talked about it. When photographs of the beam finally spread in the 1990s, Egyptologists rushed out an explanation. They have one. Later in this video, I'm going to give you that explanation, honestly, because it's a good one. But it has a problem. And that problem is the reason this investigation exists. Because that beam is not the only piece of evidence. 200 kilometers away, there is a sealed crypt beneath another temple, carved with images that modern engineers have physically rebuilt as working technology. There is a royal document that describes objects in the Egyptian sky in flat, official reporting language, a document that was copied, translated, and then vanished without a trace. And there is a star map, not painted on one wall, written into the temples, into the calendar, into the shafts of the Great Pyramid itself, all pointing at one specific point in the night sky. Because the strangest part of this story is not that Egyptian carvings might show visitors. It's that the Egyptians told us again and again, in their own words, exactly where those visitors came from. And when modern astronomy finally reached that point in the sky, thousands of years too late, what it found there is the single most disturbing detail in this entire case. That discovery lands in the second half of this video. First, we start with the stone. The beam sits in the temple of Seti I at Abydos on the west bank of the Nile, one of the holiest sites of ancient Egypt, the legendary burial place of the god Osiris himself. The temple was begun around 1290 BCE by the pharaoh Seti and finished by his son, Ramesses II, the most powerful ruler Egypt ever produced. Kings were crowned in connection with this place. Pilgrims crossed the desert for generations to reach it. This was not a provincial shrine. This was the Vatican of the ancient world. And high on a lintel in its outer hall, where the shadows sit even at midday, are the shapes. Look at published photographs, and you will see them instantly. The first is the famous one, a body shaped like a fuselage, a distinct rotor line above it, a tail assembly behind it. Next to it, a shape with a raised conning structure that viewers compare to a submarine or an airship. Then, something resembling a fixed wingcraft. Then, a fourth form that has been compared to a gunship or hovercraft. Nobody had to circle anything in red. Nobody had to enhance the image. The shapes are simply there, in relief, in stone, in a temple that predates powered flight by more than 3,000 years. When the photographs went viral in the 1990s, the reaction from Egyptology was fast and confident. The carvings, they said, are a palimpsest, an accident. And here's where you need to pay close attention, because the official explanation is genuinely elegant, and the crack in it is small but real. The claim is this: Seti carved his royal titles on that beam. When his son Ramses took over, he did what he did all over Egypt. He recarved the inscription with his own titles, filling the old glyphs with plaster and cutting new ones over them. Over 30 centuries, the plaster fell out. What remains is 2 layers of unrelated hieroglyphs stacked on top of each other. And the overlap, by pure chance, produces shapes that a modern eye reads as aircraft. It's a real phenomenon. Palimpsests exist all over Egypt. Ramses overwrote his father's work at dozens of sites. Case closed. Except for one detail. Egypt is covered in recarved inscriptions. Thousands of them. Layer over layer, plaster fallen away, glyph stacked on glyph, at Karnak, at Luxor, across the entire Nile Valley. And in all of those thousands of accidental overlaps, this beam is the one that produced 4 coherent, mechanically consistent shapes sitting in a row like a display case. Not one lucky blob. 4. Skeptics answer that the human brain finds patterns anywhere. Fair. But consider where this happened. This is not a random wall. This is the temple that houses the Abydos king list, one of the most important historical records ever carved. The document Egyptologists themselves used to reconstruct the order of the pharaohs. The priests who maintained this building were the record keepers of an entire civilization. If there was one ceiling in Egypt where a sloppy, accidental jumble of overlapping glyphs would have been noticed, corrected, or plastered back over, it was this one. Instead, it was left for 32 centuries. And when the shapes finally reached the public, the response on the ground was not curiosity, it was silence. The beam appears in almost no official guidebooks. It is rarely lit. There is no plaque. The most photographed anomaly in Egypt is treated on site as if it does not exist. Hold that thought, because the Abydos beam was never the strong evidence. It was only ever the door. The strong evidence is what's carved 200 kilometers north, underneath the floor of another temple, in rooms that were deliberately built to be hidden. Here's where it gets strange. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera is one of the best preserved temples in Egypt. Beneath its floor, reachable through narrow slots cut into the stone, are a series of crypts, sealed chambers. No windows, no ventilation. Spaces so tight you have to crouch or crawl. Built not for worshippers, but for storage of the temple's most sacred objects, and decorated with reliefs almost nobody was ever meant to see. And on the walls of Crypt C, the priests carved something that has no parallel anywhere else in Egyptian art. A giant, elongated bulb. Inside the bulb, a serpent stretched out in a rigid, unnaturally straight line from the base to the tip. The base of the bulb sits in an open lotus flower, and from that flower runs a long braided cable, connecting the object to a box. Beside it stands a jawed pillar, a column with arms physically supporting the bulb from below. In some panels, a many-armed figure holds knives beside the apparatus, and small human figures kneel underneath objects that appear to be insulating stands. Mainstream Egyptology reads this as pure mythology. The lotus opening at dawn. The serpent as the creator god Harsamtus emerging from the primeval flower. The Jed as a symbol of stability. A creation scene. Nothing more. For decades, scholars dismissed it as symbolic. Then engineers started looking at it. Because to an electrical engineer, that relief is not a mystery at all. A sealed glass envelope, a filament running its length, a cable, a junction box, an insulator supporting the tube. It is, component for component, the layout of a Crookes tube, an early form of electric lamp. And this is not just an internet claim. Engineers, most famously the Austrian electrical engineer Walter Garn, took the measurements and proportions directly from the Dendera reliefs and built physical reconstructions. The reconstructions worked. Connected to a power source, the lotus and serpent design functions as a gas discharge lamp. It glows. Now, a working model doesn't prove the Egyptians had one. You can build a working model of almost anything if you interpret loosely enough. But the Dendera crypts drag one very old question back out of the dark. How did the Egyptians light their deep chambers? Walk into the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, and you are looking at some of the finest painting ever produced by human hands. Hair-thin brushwork, perfect proportions, colors mixed and layered with total control. All of it executed hundreds of feet inside solid rock, in corridors where no sunlight has ever reached, over months and years of continuous work. The standard answer is torches and oil lamps, with polished copper mirrors relaying daylight in from the entrance. But mirror relays lose most of their light at every bounce, and they fail completely the moment a corridor turns. And the ceilings of many of those deep chambers show remarkably little of the heavy soot you'd expect from years of open flames burning in unventilated rock. Egyptologists have answers, and we'll get to them in the skeptic section, because some of them are good. But stack the sequence up. The crypts were fully documented in the early 20th century by the French Egyptologist Émile Chassinat, who spent decades recording every relief at Dendera. And even his meticulous volumes could offer no functional explanation for the bulb scenes. Nothing else in the temple looks like them. Nothing else in Egypt looks like them. Reliefs that map onto lamp technology, hidden in crypts sealed beneath the temple floor, in rooms that today remain closed to the general public. Depicting an object, the accompanying inscriptions described as an image of great secrecy connected to the soul of the god. The priests of Dendera did not carve their grocery lists into hidden vaults. They carved what they considered their most guarded knowledge, and they carved a picture of something that a 20th century engineer can look at and name. That's the second clue. The third one is the biggest, and it's the one this entire video was built around. Because carvings can be argued about forever. A skeptic and a believer can stand under the same beam and see two different things, and neither can prove the other wrong. What can't be argued with is astronomy. Stars don't care what we believe. They are where they move how they move, and any claim about them can be checked with mathematics. Which is why the next piece of evidence is so dangerous to the official story. Because the Egyptians didn't just say their gods came from the sky, they left us coordinates. And those coordinates contain a piece of information that no human being on Earth should have possessed until the invention of the telescope. Ask where the gods of Egypt came from, and the texts do not shrug. They answer. The oldest religious writings on Earth are the pyramid texts, carved inside pyramids at Saqqara more than 4,000 years ago. And over, they describe the destination of the divine dead, the origin and home of the gods, as the stars. Specifically, two targets, the belt of Orion, home of Osiris, and one star above all others. The Egyptians called it Sopdet, the Greeks called it Sothis, we call it Sirius, the brightest star in the entire night sky. And the Egyptian relationship with Sirius was not casual reverence. It was obsession, engineered into the foundations of their civilization. The entire Egyptian calendar, the calendar that governed planting, taxation, and kingship, was anchored to one single astronomical event, the heliacal rising of Sirius. The one morning each year when Sirius reappears on the horizon just before dawn after 70 days of invisibility. That morning was New Year's Day. That morning announced the flooding of the Nile, the event Egypt's survival depended on. The goddess Isis, the divine mother of every pharaoh, was identified with Sirius directly. And here is a detail most documentaries miss. Sirius disappears from the Egyptian sky for 70 days each year, swallowed by the glare of the sun, before returning at dawn. 70 days, which is exactly, to the day, how long the Egyptian mummification ritual lasted. The body of the dead was prepared for 70 days because the soul was believed to be making the same journey as the star, through darkness before rising again. The most important ritual in Egyptian civilization was a synchronized clock set to Sirius. Temples were physically aimed at it. The Temple of Isis at Dendera, the same complex hiding those crypts, was aligned so that the light of the rising Sirius traveled down its axis into the sanctuary. And inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber, a channel only 20 centimeters wide, sealed at both ends, running through 60 meters of solid masonry, was angled so that at the time of construction it pointed at the meridian transit of one object in the sky, Sirius. In 1993, a German engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a robot up that shaft, and its camera stopped at something nobody expected: a polished limestone slab blocking the channel, fitted with 2 copper pins, a sealed door with metal hardware at the top of the Sirius shaft in a place no human being could ever reach. It has never been opened, a star so important that the largest building on the planet had a dedicated, sealed channel aimed at it. Fine, a skeptic says. It's the brightest star. Of course they worshipped it. And if that were the whole story, this video would end here. It isn't, because Sirius is not one star. In 1844, the astronomer Friedrich Bessel noticed Sirius wobbling, as if something massive and invisible was tugging on it. In 1862, the telescope maker Alvin Graham Clark finally saw it. A tiny, crushingly dense companion star, locked in orbit around Sirius. Sirius B. It is a white dwarf, the collapsed corpse of a star, so dense that a single teaspoon of its material would weigh tons. It orbits Sirius once every 50 years. It is completely invisible to the naked eye. No human being, anywhere on Earth, at any point in history, could have seen it without a powerful modern telescope. It wasn't even successfully photographed until 1970. Now, here is the reveal this entire investigation has been building toward. In the 1930s, decades before that photograph existed, French anthropologists Marcel Griol and Germain Dieterlen began living with the Dogon people of Mali, in West Africa. And the Dogon elders shared with them their most sacred tradition. They said Sirius has a companion. They called it Potolo, the star of the phonio seed, the smallest seed they knew, because the star is tiny. They said it is the heaviest thing in the sky, made of a metal denser than all the iron on Earth. They said it circles Sirius in an orbit of about 50 years, and their most important ceremony, the Sigui, was tied to that cycle. Grial and Dieterlen published these traditions in a French academic paper in 1950, describing a heavy, invisible companion of Sirius with a 50-year orbit, 20 years before any photograph of Sirius B existed. Tiny, impossibly dense, 50-year orbit, invisible. Every property of Sirius B, preserved in the oral tradition of a people with no telescopes, no observatories, and no contact with modern astronomy. The Dogon even tied their calendar to it. Their greatest ceremony, the Sigui, a ritual of renewal passed down for centuries, follows the rhythm of that hidden star's orbit. And when the Dogon were asked how they knew, they did not claim to have figured it out. They said they were taught by beings they called the Namo, amphibious teachers who came down from the sky, from the Sirius system, in a vessel of fire and thunder, and gave humanity knowledge. In 1976, the researcher Robert Temple published a book called The Sirius Mystery, arguing one step further, that the Dogon tradition was not born in Mali, that it migrated there, carried down through the centuries, from the civilization that was obsessed with Sirius before anyone else, Egypt. The same Egypt whose goddess Isis, the Sirius goddess, was said to have taught humanity agriculture, medicine, and writing. The same Egypt whose priests told the Greeks that their gods had come to the Nile in the distant past and ruled before any human king. If you're the kind of person who follows evidence like this all the way down, hit subscribe, because this channel investigates suppressed discoveries and sealed sites every single week, and this case is still not finished. Because Egypt did not only tell us where they came from, Egypt wrote down what it looked like when they were here. And that document is the part of this story that someone made disappear. It's known as the Tulli Papyrus. In 1933, Alberto Tulli, director of the Egyptian section of the Vatican Museum, found a papyrus in an antique shop in Cairo. The price was too high, so he copied the text by hand. What it contained, once translated, reads like nothing else in Egyptian literature. It presents itself as an entry from the royal annals of Thutmose III, around 1480 BCE, and it reports, in the dry tone of an official log, that scribes of the House of Life observed a circle of fire coming in the sky. It gives an estimate of its size. It says the object had no head, and no voice. It says that after some days, the circles of fire became many, that they shone brighter than the sun, and that the pharaoh and his army watched them before the objects ascended higher in the sky and departed toward the south. Fish and birds were said to fall from the sky afterward. The scribes recorded it. The text says, so that it would be remembered forever. No gods invoked as the cause, no mythological framing. An observation report, filed by the most literate bureaucracy of the ancient world, under a warrior pharaoh not known for fantasy. Thutmose III was the Napoleon of Egypt, a man who led 17 military campaigns and never lost one, whose scribes recorded troop counts, tribute lists, and enemy casualties with cold accuracy. These were not poets. These were accountants of empire, and they logged multiple luminous objects maneuvering over Egypt, watched by the army itself, ascending and departing toward the south. The translation was prepared by Prince Boris de Rachwiltz, a respected Egyptologist who declared the text authentic and untampered. So, where is the papyrus? Gone. After Tulli died in 1954, the original papyrus was never located. When investigators, including researchers working with the United States Air Force's Condon Committee in the 1960s, went looking for it, the Vatican stated it did not have it and never had. The hand copy survived, the translation survived, and the source vanished. Skeptics argue the papyrus may never have been genuine at all, and we'll weigh that fairly in a moment. But notice the shape of the pattern, because it repeats across this entire case. The Dendera crypts closed to the public. The shaft aimed at Sirius, sealed at both ends, and blocked by a slab with metal fittings that has still never been opened. The one written account of objects in Egypt's sky evaporated. Every time this trail produces a physical object, you could actually test. The object becomes unavailable. And there's one more document that almost no one brings up in this context, because it's hiding in plain sight in an academic museum. The Turin Royal Canon, an official Egyptian king list written in the age of Ramesses. Before it names a single human pharaoh, it records who ruled Egypt first, gods, reigning for hundreds and thousands of years each. And after the gods, a line of beings the Egyptians called the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, ruling for a combined 13,420 years before the first mortal king ever wore the crown. Egyptologists file that section under mythology and move on. But the Egyptians didn't write it in a book of myths. They wrote it in a king list, the same administrative document they used to record real reigns of real rulers. They weren't telling a story. They were keeping records. And the Turin Canon is not alone. Carved across the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu is a body of inscriptions known as the building texts, and they describe where the founders of Egypt's temples came from. They speak of the 7 sages, beings of enormous knowledge who arrived in Egypt from a distant homeland, an island of the primeval ones, after that homeland was destroyed in a sudden catastrophe of water. The texts say these survivors traveled the Nile, established the sacred sites, and laid out the temples according to a divine plan brought from somewhere else. Egyptologists read this as origin mythology. But notice that Egypt's own priests never claimed the knowledge was theirs. Across texts written centuries apart, in different cities, by different cults, the story stays consistent. Someone arrived, someone taught, someone left instructions. The Egyptians spent 3,000 years following them. Now, let's slow down and be honest with each other. Does all of this prove that alien visitors walked the Nile and that Egypt's authorities have been hiding them? Probably not. And you should be suspicious of anyone who tells you it's certain. So here is the strongest version of the skeptical case. The Abydos beam really is a palimpsest. Photographs show the overlapping titles of Seti and Ramesses, and reconstructions of the 2 inscription layers account for the shapes. Pattern recognition does the rest. The Dendera reliefs sit inside a coherent Egyptian creation mythology. the serpent born from the lotus. And the accompanying texts talk about gods, not equipment. The soot question has answers too. Soot has been found in plenty of tombs, some ceilings were cleaned in modern times, and experiments show that oil lamps with salted wicks burn remarkably clean. The Dogon evidence took real damage in 1991, when the anthropologist Walter Van Beek spent years with the Dogon and could not find widespread knowledge of an invisible companion star, raising the possibility that Griola's informants had absorbed the idea from earlier Western visitors, since Sirius B was already famous in the 1920s, and the Tulli Papyrus cannot be authenticated without the original, which means it cannot carry weight on its own. Every individual clue has a conventional explanation. That's true, and it matters. But here is what the conventional story still cannot do. It cannot explain why a civilization at the very dawn of history anchored its entire existence to one star with a precision that still startles astronomers, tracking a cycle, the Sothic cycle, that only completes once every 1,460 years, longer than the memory of any dynasty. It cannot explain why the Queen's Chamber shaft was aimed at Sirius and then deliberately sealed, with copper fittings mounted on a slab where no human eye could ever reach them. It cannot explain why Egypt's own official records insist, without embarrassment, that non-human rulers governed the Nile for over 10,000 years before the first pharaoh, or why the priests of Dendera buried their most secret images in crypts under the floor. And it cannot explain why the Egyptians themselves, when asked where their knowledge came from, never once claimed to have invented it. They said it was given. In the first time, Zep-Tepi, when the gods lived on Earth. Even the grounded version of this story is extraordinary. At minimum, it means the earliest Egyptians inherited an astronomical and technical tradition already old, already refined, from a source we have never identified. Knowledge doesn't come from nowhere. Someone accumulated it. The only question is who. And if the other version is true, even partially, then our history is missing a chapter. It would mean civilization was not slowly invented on the banks of the Nile. It was delivered there. It would mean the gods in the carvings were memories, not metaphors. And the star the whole culture pointed at was not a symbol, but an address. One final question, and then I'll leave you with the stone. If the teachers came from the Sirius system, and the Egyptians spent 3,000 years watching that exact point in the sky, generation after generation, never letting the alignment drift, what were they watching for? Tonight, the temple at Abydos will go dark. The beam with the four shapes will hang in the blackness the way it has for 32 centuries, above a floor where tourists never look up. 200 kilometers away, the crypts under Dendera will sit sealed and silent. And just before dawn, in the eastern sky, Sirius will rise over the Nile, right on schedule, exactly where the temples still point. The carvings are still there. The crypts are still closed. The shaft is still sealed. And the star still comes back every single year, as if it's keeping an appointment. If you want to know what else the ancient world recorded that we've been told to walk past, watch the next investigation on screen right now.